This mixing with mic tip is on analog compression explained. So let's go into a little bit of why we need analog compressors and how they came to be about in the first place. Analog compression was created to solve a basic issue with audio, and that is that the voltages from performances captured through microphones would vary pretty greatly or dramatically based off of the performance. And as a result, the only way to deal with that was by the engineer actually controlling the gain control, which would be in either a rotary form or in a fader form, which is basically the same thing, and controlling the gain that way. But the problem is that the ability of the engineer to act instantaneously to transient peaks or jumps in level is almost impossible because the reaction time would always be delayed. And so devices were created to help control or contain some of this. Some of it happened naturally through some of the components that were being used, like tubes and analog tape, which has a saturation built right into it. But the primary reason here is to help to avoid distortion, to control the overall or contain the overall gain stage or level so that it can be recorded cleanly without noise onto analog tape or vinyl or digital or whatever, and for broadcast use to transmit the signal out over longer distances. So it's been employed in many different ways. Now, essentially, the basics of compression is that you have a threshold. And when the threshold is exceeded, this engages compression. The attack time then is looked to. So if the attack time is, say, 20 milliseconds, then it will delay the onset of compression by 20 milliseconds. A sort of subset of the attack time is the knee, which determines how aggressively that is applied, whether it's sort of smoothed in, sort of like a crossfading of compression, or whether it's applied instantaneously. The ratio is then employed because that determines the amount of compression. A 2-to-1 ratio will take every 2 dB above threshold and allow 1 dB to come out. And if you increase that to 10-to-1, for every 10 dB, 1 dB comes out. So it's just a basic form of downward compression. Then, once the signal falls back below threshold, then you have the release time, which is taken into effect, and that's how long it takes to go back to an uncompressed signal. And then you have a makeup gain stage. But this is the primary basic formula or flow of compression. And it's all based on a threshold. So when the signal passes above threshold, it may pass above by a certain amount. And let's just say you had a fast attack and a fast release, then the output signal may come back at half the output level if you had a 2-to-1 ratio. That's the basic idea. So with analog components, what they were dealing with was not just the math. The math is actually very simple and it's easy to explain. But when you get into actually developing and creating analog components that do this, you basically come down to 4 different types that work pretty effectively, and that's what we're going to kind of get into here. So when we look at the basic types of analog compressors, you find that there are 4 basic types. The optical compressor, sometimes called opto, and this uses a photoelectric material. So basically you're feeding an audio signal as a voltage into a lamp, or which started out as like more with a filament and became more of an LED kind of thing. And then you would have a component, a photoelectric sensitive device that would be reading those variations in strength of light. And so that was the way that the optical component would then be used to control the gain stage of the amplifier. Then there is a VCA form of compression, and that's a voltage controlled amplifier. So what happens is the actual input voltage is fed into a gain stage, and then the output of that actual gain stage is fed back in. So it's sort of like a feedback form of compression, and that's a whole other discussion. There's feed forward and feedback compression. This is a feedback compression, and so that output voltage would then be fed back in, and this would determine the amount of compression that would basically be applied. So you have VCA compressors. Variable mu, mu is just a word for gain, and so varamu is like a vacuum tube compression form of compression. And so basically, essentially in a nutshell, what you're doing is you're controlling the bias current and varying the bias current to control gain through the tube. And this also adds a form of distortion. they all add different forms of distortion which color the sound. We'll get into that in the individual videos when we talk about the different types of compressors. And then there's the FET, field effect transistor. So this is using a particular type of transistor where its gain can be controlled by the output signal. So essentially, we're always dealing with gain stages here and controlling gain stages. So whether we're using optical components to do that, voltage controlled amplifiers to do that, variable mu or vacuum tube form of compression to control that, or the FET, which is a variable transistor essentially, component to do that, then this is how gain reduction can be achieved. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. They all add certain sound characteristics, and this is part of what makes analog interesting and makes some of these components. And the reason why we go to them versus just the straight math clean compressor that you would find in plug-in form, there's a reason why we go to analog components, because it's adding something. It's adding a characteristic to the sound, and that's the basic idea. Now, there will be 4 individual tips that will go into each type of compressor in more detail, what they're good for, and the reasons why you would want to use them. So this is our Mixing with Mike tip on analog compression and the basics of it explained. Hope you enjoyed this, and if you are interested in following the Mixing with Mike classes, they are every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You can attend for free if you go to mpginsider.com, sign up for the newsletter, then you will receive all the links and information for attending the live classes for free, and feel free to join the Mixing with Mike classes by clicking on the link, and this will give you access to all the previous classes and all the tips that I create here from Mixing with Mike. Thanks for tuning in.